Alright, let me paint a picture for you. Picture a humid, sticky hot night down in the Louisiana bayou. You can almost feel the air clinging to your skin, it's so thick. And then there's also that smell of swamp water and the old cypress trees. The only sounds are the occasional splash of an alligator or the haunting call of a bird somewhere off in the darkness. And there we were, 5 wildlife researchers with nothing but our flashlights, notebooks, and a solid dose of skepticism. We'd heard the stories from the locals, ghost lights that wandered in the deep swamp, glowing orbs that would appear out of nowhere only to vanish just as quickly. Most folks said they were the spirits of the dead, doomed to roam the swamp for all eternity. But we weren't believers. We chalked it up to swamp gas or maybe a trick of the light. But that's also why we were there. We wanted to see for ourselves and debunk it ourselves so we knew once and for all. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I started to feel. It wasn't just the swamp itself, it was something more, something that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. The locals had warned us. They practically begged us not to go, but we kind of just brushed them off. You know, we're city folk who thought they knew better. They're just some jungle people. Looking back, I'd give anything to go back to that moment and listen. After about an hour, we saw the first light. It was just a tiny glow in the distance, bobbing slowly through the trees. At first, I thought it was someone with a flashlight. Maybe a hunter or another research team, you know? Maybe we weren't the only ones out here. But then more appeared. First there was 2, then there was 3, and then there was a dozen of them all over the place, all drifting aimlessly through the dense underbrush. They just hovered, pulsating softly, a pale, sickly, greenish blue color that didn't look quite natural. One of my roommates, Andy, whispered, "It's just swamp gas, right?" I'm thinking the same thing. It has to be. Even though, as I said it, I didn't believe it. We pushed forward, following the lights deeper into the swamp. They seemed to float just beyond our reach, almost like they were toying with us, leading us along on some invisible trail. Every now and then they'd flicker and vanish, only to reappear a little further away, luring us in. As we walked, it became hard to keep track of where we were. The swamp has a way of making you feel like you're walking in circles, and in the dead of night, it's 10 times worse. Trees and shadows start to look the same, and even the trail we'd marked began to seem unfamiliar. And then came the voices. At first, they were barely a whisper, just like a low murmur kind of floating through the dense air. It sounded like someone was calling our names, or maybe just muttering nonsense, but it was enough to make us stop dead in our tracks. We all stood there, looking at each other with this expression of, "Did you hear that?" And of course, we all heard it. The lights were still there too, bobbing and weaving just ahead. And against every ounce of logic, we kept following them. It's like they were drawing us in, pulling us closer to something. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a clearing. And that's when things got wrong. The lights didn't hover off in the distance this time. They started circling around us, close enough that I could feel their eerie glow on my skin. And they weren't random anymore. They formed a ring, closing us in, trapping us. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted in place, like the swamp itself had latched onto me. The voices grew louder, and now they were clear as day. They weren't nonsense. They were our names. Our names over and over, whispered like a chant. Andy tried to step forward, and that's when he tripped over something half buried in the muck. He reached down, pulled, and froze. In his hands was a half-rotted skull, the empty eye socket staring up at him. And then he screamed, stumbling back, because all around us were bones, scattered everywhere. Skulls, ribs, fingers, old, ancient bones, and fresh ones too, all tangled up in this muck. The lights flickered and we heard something moving in the trees. A low, wet sloshing sound, like something dragging itself through the swamp. It got louder, closer, until we saw it. I don't even know how to describe what came out of those trees. It looked human, almost, but its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, like it had dried out, like mummified. Its eyes were nothing but dark pits, and its mouth was open in like a horrible, silent scream. It didn't walk, it crawled, dragging itself closer, leaving a dark, slimy trail in its wake. Sarah tried to scream, but nothing came out. And then the thing started moving faster, its long, bony fingers reaching for us. And then it stood, towering over us like some kind of nightmare come to life. I don't remember who ran first. All I know is 1 second we were frozen in terror, and the next we were tearing through the swamp, tripping over roots and stumbling through the mud, desperate to get away from whatever was out there. But the swamp didn't want us to leave. Every direction we turned, we'd find ourselves right back at that clearing. Those ghostly lights circling, the bones scattered like some kind of sick warning. And every time the thing was closer, its hollow eyes locked onto us, its hand reaching out like it was ready to pull us down into the swamp and never let us go. Somehow, by some miracle, we managed to break free. We didn't stop running until we hit solid ground, the first bit of dry land we'd seen all night. We collapsed there, panting, covered in mud and swamp water, too shaken to even speak. When we finally made it back to town, no one believed us. They just shook their heads, muttering about city folk and the tricks the swamp plays on the mind. But I know what we saw. And every time I close my eyes, I can still see those lights, hear those words. The locals were right. The bayou doesn't let go of its dead. And if you're foolish enough to go looking for them, you might just end up one of them yourself. Nothing but a whisper and a light in the darkness. It was a dark night, deep in the backwoods near some old railroad tracks. You can feel that heavy, silent stillness hanging in the air. It's the kind of night where the stars don't even seem to shine as bright, and the forest around you feels more like a cage than anything else. And that's where we were. 5 friends camping out by the tracks for a little adventure. We'd heard the stories before, of course. Every town has its legends. They called it the Phantom Train, a ghostly locomotive that supposedly roams the tracks, carrying the souls of the dead. They say if you see it, it means it's come to claim you, and once it finds you, it doesn't stop until you're a passenger on that train forever. But we were city kids, and honestly, we didn't believe a word of it. The tracks were abandoned decades ago. They didn't even go anywhere anymore. So we laughed, toasted some marshmallows, and kept going on with our ghost stories, daring each other to spend the night right there by the tracks. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard it. The faint sound of a train whistle cutting through the quiet night. We all froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. It didn't make any sense. There hadn't been a working train on those tracks in years. But we all heard it clear as day. And then it came again, but louder this time, and followed by the unmistakable rumble of a train moving down the tracks. We crept closer to the edge of the woods, close enough to see the tracks stretching into the darkness, and that's when we saw it. A dim, eerie light flickering just down the line, like an old-fashioned lantern swaying in the night. Who else would be out this late? Sarah whispered, but none of us had an answer. But as we watched, the lights grew brighter, and the rumble got louder until we could make out the shape of a massive, dark locomotive bearing down the tracks toward us. Only something was off. The train wasn't quite solid. It flickered, faded, and then sharpened again like an image on a broken TV. The closer it got, the more wrong it looked. The engine was rusted and covered in grime, with shattered windows and a glow that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside it, not from any light we knew. We should have turned and run right then, but we were frozen, trapped by the sight of this thing bearing down on us. As it passed us, the windows of the cars were filled with faces, pale, empty-eyed faces that stared out, blank and lifeless. They were packed in there, crammed shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead like they were seeing something far beyond us. Their mouths were open, but there was no sound, only that low, eerie rumble of the train passing through the night. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the train started to fade, the whistle blowing one last mournful cry. The light grew dimmer until finally it vanished altogether, leaving us alone in the darkness with nothing but the quiet of the woods around us. We stood there in stunned silence, hardly able to breathe. But we all knew what we had seen, and as we turned back to our campsite, something else hit us. The ground where the tracks lay was freezing cold, the warmth of the fire barely reaching us now, and each of us felt it. The sense that something was watching. That night none of us slept. We huddled together by the fire trying to shake off the fear that hung over us, the thought that maybe we hadn't been alone out there by those tracks. Then, just before dawn, we heard the whistle again, softer this time, almost like it was calling out to us. And that's when we saw them, our shadows stretched out along the ground. Except they didn't quite match us. Our shadows were moving on their own, lagging just a bit behind, like something was pulling them toward the tracks. It was like something had latched onto us, a presence, a force we couldn't see but could definitely feel. We could sense it, cold and relentless, like it was drawing us closer and closer to the tracks, waiting for us to make the final move. We grabbed our gear, tore down our tents, and practically ran out of those woods. But even as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every step, I could hear something behind us, the faintest echo of footsteps that stopped when we stopped, started when we did. When we finally reached the car, we threw our stuff in and sped off, not even looking back. But as we hit the edge of town, Jake pulled over, his face pale as a ghost. He held up his hand, and there, etched into his skin like a fresh burn, was a series of faint lines and curves. It resembled rails. And he wasn't the only one. Each of us found the same mark somewhere in our bodies, like a brand, a reminder. That night I went home and scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to get rid of that mark. But it didn't fade. Not that night, not ever. After that, we all tried to forget. We tried to move on, but the nightmares never stopped. Every so often, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that whistle, feeling that rumble of the phantom train moving closer, like it was still searching for us. Sometimes when I'm alone, I catch my reflection out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second, I'll swear it's not me looking back. It's like there's someone else there, just waiting for the right moment to pull me back to those tracks, to drag me onto that cursed train. So if you're ever out by those old railroad tracks and you hear the sound of that distant whistle, take my advice. Don't investigate. Don't wait around to see what's coming. Because once the phantom train finds you, it won't stop until it's claimed you as its next passenger. And then, just like those faces we saw in the windows, you'll be staring out, forever trapped on that ghostly locomotive, waiting for someone else to take your place. We were just a small group of hikers. There was 4 of us. It was me, my best friend Jake, and these 2 other hikers we'd met at the trailhead, Sarah and Mike. At first, everything was normal. Birds chirping, leaves crunching underfoot, nothing unusual. But as we hiked deeper, the forest got quieter, like something had pressed the mute button on all the life around us. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind felt like it was holding its breath. We kept walking, though, brushing off the weird silence. I mean, we were out here to escape the noise of the city, right? But after a while, we started hearing something strange. At first, it was faint, just like a soft whisper that you couldn't quite make out. But then I heard again, clearer this time. It was my voice. Not just my voice, my words. Something out there was repeating the exact same sentence I'd said minutes before. I stopped dead in my tracks, and Jake looked at me like I'd lost it. He asked me what's wrong. So I told him. It's like I think I just heard myself. He kind of laughed, but there was an edge to it. It's probably just an echo. Sound does weird stuff out here, he said. I wanted to believe him. We all did. But the forest was so still, so silent that it didn't feel like an echo. And then a minute later, I heard Jake's voice coming from somewhere behind us, repeating what he just said to me. And then Sarah goes, "Alright, that's creepy." And I look over at her and she's got this terrified look on her face. We all tried to keep calm, told ourselves it was just a trick of the mountains, maybe the way sound bounced around the trees. But deep down we were all spooked. So we did what anyone would do. We picked up pace, walked a little faster, like we could out-hike whatever weirdness was going on. But it didn't stop. Every few minutes one of us would hear our own voice echoing through the trees, repeating something we'd said. And it wasn't always exactly the same either. Sometimes it was like the voice was trying to mimic us, but getting it just a little bit wrong. A laugh that sounded too sharp, a word that came out twisted. It was like there was a delay, but it wasn't just our words that it was copying. It was our tone, our inflections, everything. And then we saw it. Came around a bend, and there, standing in the shadows, was me. Or at least it looked like me. It had my same hiking clothes, the same backpack, even the same scar on my cheek from a bike accident years ago. But its face, it didn't look quite right. It was smiling, but it was a forced, stretched out grin, like it didn't know how to hold a human expression. Jake stumbled back, staring at the thing, but it didn't move. It just stood there, smiling that horrible, unnatural smile. And then it spoke. Using my voice, it copied Jake's reaction just a moment ago, but there was like no emotion behind it. Just a flat, empty echo of my words. I looked over at Jake and his face was pale. The thing didn't move, didn't blink, it just kept grinning. Then turned and walked back into the shadows, disappearing behind the trees. But even after it was gone, I could feel it watching us, like its eyes were still somewhere close, hidden beyond our sight. We turned around, ready to head back the way we'd come, but as soon as we did, we saw Sarah. Except it wasn't Sarah. It was the same twisted smile, that same vacant look. It raised its hand and waved, just like she had when we'd first met her at the trailhead. Only it didn't look like a wave anymore. It looked like a puppet being forced to mimic a wave. It was so weird. And then we heard footsteps all around us. The crunching of leaves, soft and deliberate. There was more than one now. They were everywhere. These copies, these things that looked like us but weren't us. Every time we turned, there was another one, just far enough away that we couldn't see their faces clearly, but we could feel their eyes on us. We started running, and as we ran, they ran too, mimicking our movements exactly. Every stumble, every panicked breath, it was like we were being mirrored. I glanced to my side and saw myself running beside me. That eerie, stretched out grin on its face, staring at me without blinking, without even looking forward as it ran. I heard Jake scream and I saw why. One of the mimics, a twisted copy of him, wasn't just running beside him. It was slowly shifting, closing the distance, reaching out a hand like it was going to grab him. We pushed ourselves harder, our legs burning, our breaths ragged. But no matter how fast we ran, the mimics matched our pace, like they were part of the forest itself, like they'd always been there waiting. Finally, we stumbled back onto the main trail, and for a second everything went quiet. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. We looked around and the forest seemed normal again. Just trees and shadows and silence. We didn't wait. We bolted for the parking lot, practically leaping into the car. And we sped right out of there, leaving the trailhead and the twisted forest behind us. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that those things, those copies, are still out there watching. Maybe even waiting. Sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room, I swear I hear my voice whispering back at me from somewhere just beyond the walls. So if you're ever out hiking in the mountains and you hear something that sounds like you, or see someone that looks just a little too familiar, run. Because whatever's out there, it's learning, and one day it might decide to take your place.